Happy to be here for this final installment in the FEDTalks series and talking about something I think that is very important for leaders, particularly in the federal government, but also in the private sector, and that is recognizing and making ethical decisions, recognizing ethical issues and making ethical decisions. Let's get started. So here's our path today. We're going to look at how we go about identifying and recognizing ethical issues, how to resolve those ethical issues and make decisions that involve ethical issues. And if we have time at the end to talk about how to create a culture of ethical decision-making. So let's talk a little bit about what we're really discussing here with ethical issues. I'm going to go through a number of what I think are common ethical issues or dilemmas that we deal with or may deal with on a regular basis. So this first one that was maybe out of date since nobody apparently uses cash anymore. Clerk at the grocery store gives me too much change. Do I return it? Does it matter how much money is involved? What if I've already left the store and I've parked 2 parking lots away and it's raining and it's cold and I'm wet? Does that change what I do? Or let's stay in the mall parking lot here. I've sideswiped someone's car. I'm using this example because recently my car got sideswiped. I've sideswiped someone's car. No, I'm confident no one saw me do it. Do I leave a note on their windshield? Do I take ownership of that? Playing golf, I commit a rules infraction that no one else notices. Now, according to the rules, I should be reporting myself, but do I? Does it matter that I don't think I've actually benefited from this infraction? Or your coworker claims to have received the COVID vaccine. You know they're not vaccinated. And in fact, they're using fake documentation. Should you report them? Do you report them? Are there factors that would influence you one way or another in terms of reporting this? This next example is typically called the trolley problem. You've got a train barreling down the tracks. One track has 5 workers on it who do not notice the train coming and will surely be killed. But you have control of a switch that you can flip, which will move the train to a different track, saving those 5 workers. But by doing so, the train moves to a different track where a child is playing and will be sadly and unfortunately killed. There's no time to warn either of them. What do? Do you do nothing? Because that's a decision right there. Do you flip the switch or do you leave it as it is? And then, that was the final one. So these are a number of common ethical issues that you can deal with both in your daily life and in your professional life. And they're sometimes not as easy as you might think to decide. You might think, oh, I would surely return to the grocery store and bring that money back. Absolutely. Even if it was $10, $20, even if it was 50 cents. But what if it is raining? What if you have walked 2 blocks? What if you recently sprained your ankle and you just got back to the car and you just noticed it? Would you then? So circumstances have a great influence on how we deal with ethical issues in our decision-making. So why do we even care about recognizing ethical issues and making ethical decisions? Well, they engender trust and loyalty. They're the root of future good decision-making. They promote the greater good. They promotes following rules and doing the right thing. It demonstrates fairness and respect. And it shows that you consider others beyond yourself. And then finally, and importantly, it empowers other people to do the same. And that's ultimately what you're trying to get. You're trying to create and nurture an environment, a culture of ethical behavior and ethical decision making. And then finally, your decisions and how ethical they are and how good they are is one main reason, one main factor that people look at, your staff, others, to evaluate you as a person and a leader. And if you are not evaluated or perceived as someone who is ethical and makes ethical decisions, then you will not have too many followers. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we mean by ethics versus morals or values. So ethics are typically a set of rules or a code of conduct or behavior for an organization or a profession. And so we've got government ethics, scientific ethics, and I can hear the laughter throughout Zoom right now. There are attorney ethics and medical ethics. So these are rules of what's right and wrong for a particular profession or a particular organization. Now, morals and values, a lot of times we use these words, ethics, morals, and values, interchangeably. Ethics certainly has a certain definition. Morals are more what we think is right and wrong to us personally, rather than as a profession or as a group or an organization. Now, some of those may in fact line up, but that's kind of one way of looking at the difference. So again, these are standards or rules governing the conduct which in a particular organization or a particular group, and sometimes what society believes is right and wrong. And many of you here are government employees and leaders in the federal government. And so we have government ethics that we have to be concerned with. And one of the things that we're going to talk about in terms of decision-making and having a ethical decision-making framework is having a good understanding of what actual rules apply. So here we have the merit system principles, which declare that you should do certain things, you hire based on merit. Then you have what are called the prohibited personnel practices. Those are the thou shalt not do. Thou shalt not retaliate against people for blowing the whistle. And then you have the actual rules from the Office of Government Ethics. And it's important to understand what these rules are. And as one of the first ethics rules in the government ethics is understanding that public service is a public trust. And as we read this slide and look at this slide, that loyalty is placed to the Constitution, laws, and ethical principles above private gain. And that it's important for citizens to understand that that is what federal employees are doing, that they're placing their loyalty to the Constitution, to the laws of the United States, and to ethical principles above anything else. So, why do you need to be able to recognize and address ethical issues? Well, ethical dilemmas are typically lurking in nearly every difficult decision you would face. They're somewhere there. They may be difficult to tease out, or they may just be slapping you right in the face. But they're there in nearly every difficult decision you make. And you have to be able to recognize these ethical issues in order to have the decision-making experience and framework to make these ethically bound decisions. Without it, you're lost. If you can't recognize it and you don't know it's an issue, then you're bound to make a really bad or unethical decision. And ethical decision-making is based on core character behaviors and values, such as honesty, respect, responsibility, and fairness. So these are all important reasons to understand how to recognize ethical issues. So what I want to do is just set up kind of a 5-point decision-making framework. But as you'll see, really probably the most important part of this framework is the first one. And that is, you have to be able to identify what the ethical issue or dilemma is. Again, as I just said, without that, it's going to be very difficult for you to make a decision that's based on ethics, and the foundation is based on ethics. Now, some of these others are important, obviously, in making the decision and identifying possible options and consequences. But that first one is clearly the most important one. And we're going to spend most of the time today talking about that. So first, you want to see if there's an actual ethical rule or principle that does apply here. Maybe there is something specific that tells you, no, in fact, you cannot do that, or yes, you can do that. And as we'll get to in a second, even if you can, the question many times is whether you should. Maybe procurement ethics rules or financial ethics rules that apply. And if those apply, you need to be aware of those and keep those in mind. So if there is a clear answer, and if the answer is yes, again, it's not always yes, we'll just go ahead and do it because it's allowed. But the question is, and many times the issue is whether you should do it, even if you can. And that's where some of these ethical dilemmas become very difficult. All right. So you need to be attuned to ethics and moral questions to be able to recognize these issues. So one of the first steps, obviously, is understanding what the ethical rules are that apply and what other rules there are. Maybe other rules that bound the behavior, typically ethical rules. And you need to understand why these rules exist. Why does a certain rule exist that you can accept something from a contractor that technically doesn't constitute a gift or a prohibited gift? There's reasoning behind all these rules. And it's important to understand that reasoning as you go forward, because it may be that a situation or decision you're facing allows you to take some action. But again, you may not want to. I think a lot of this also, in terms of recognizing ethics issues, it starts with intuition. And that's really the beginning, because think about when you were a child and you had your parents or your caretaker telling you, no, don't do that. You can't do that. That's wrong. That's wrong. And we learn that from a young age, and hopefully we continue to learn that as we grow up and work in organizations and learn what is right and wrong, what is good and bad behavior, what is acceptable and what is not. So one thing you can do, and these are all variations of a similar question, when you're in a scenario or situation that you are having difficulty with, is, does this situation just not feel right? In fact, does it feel wrong? Certainly then you're likely looking at an ethical dilemma. Is there some kind of emotional uneasiness about this situation? And again, is this question or situation you're dealing with difficult or hard to figure out? So you're probably then dealing with an ethical issue. All right, so we're still continuing to figure out ways to identify and recognize ethical issues. But it's important to also understand that most ethical issues are not really about right or wrong. Most ethical dilemmas actually are about right versus right. And there we are typically dealing with a clash of core values or core principles. And that's the nature of an ethical dilemma. And we've got these two sub bullet points here that describe that you've got two moral principles that conflict with one another, or that no matter what you do, some ethical principle will be compromised. And that's what makes these difficult, not the clear right versus wrong. Hopefully, when we're presented with that, we actually just do what is right if something is clearly wrong. And here are these core values or core principles that typically clash. I just want to give you a second to look at these. And you may have, in any given situation, you may have one or more of these clash of core values happening at the same time. So let's look at each one of these. Truth versus loyalty. So truth is this obligation to perhaps share information with someone versus this loyalty to the organization or a group or a person to keep information confidential. And I know many of you deal with this kind of dynamic a lot in your work and have dealt with it, or certainly will deal with it as you go through your career. And one example typically is, maybe I have my organization that I'm working for is thinking about downsizing and maybe farming out or contracting out jobs. And I know the boss, and I've talked to the boss about it, and I've found out some information that if there are job cuts, my peer down the hall, Bob, may lose his job. Well, what do I do when Bob comes to me and he knows I'm friends with the boss and he knows the boss might have talked? Do I have some obligation to tell Bob? What about my obligation if Bob says, hey, don't tell anybody about this? Do I have an obligation there? And how do I resolve that dilemma? There are also, we'll get to this in a second, short-term and long-term implications here. If I'm in the middle of my career, beginning of my career, I care what this peer thinks. I care what the boss thinks. And how do I resolve this issue? Next is the individual versus the community. And we are seeing kind of this play out in real time with the pandemic over the last 18 months or so. And we're seeing it with respect to the federal employee and large employers vaccine mandate, with mask mandates, social distancing mandates of all kinds throughout the country, in communities, counties, states, throughout the country. With many people thinking, you know what, I as an individual have my rights, I can take care of myself, versus this obligation that we have to other people to do no harm. And how do we figure out how to deal with that conflict? Okay. Similar issue, short-term versus long-term. And again, unfortunately, this COVID pandemic provides us examples of this. And the short term, we would rather not have to do these things, get a vaccine, wear a mask. We'd rather be around our friends. But long term, we know we need to not do this for a while. We need to be careful for a while so that hopefully we can get past this. So again, we've got this clash of values, clash of core values. It also comes into play with budget. And many of you deal with budgets, budgetary issues and resources, and deciding what to do. And maybe short term, something actually does not work for spending resources. And you may need to have some cuts or do some cuts for the long-term health and benefit of the organization. And then lastly, you have justice versus mercy. And justice is this notion that you have to, or you may be in the position of administering some punishment. This typically deals with employees and discipline or actual termination of employees. And this is this core value of justice sometimes comes right into conflict with the idea of mercy, that perhaps in a given situation, we have to exhibit compassion. And this can be very difficult. For example, if you have an employee who's been recently a poor performer and the coworkers know it and they're upset about it because that person is not pulling their weight, and you know you need to do something about it. Well, perhaps you also know that there's a reason why this is happening. And maybe you need to demonstrate mercy for this individual and compassion, because maybe in a couple of months they will go beyond this and be back to their normal good performance. So these are just some of the core values that we deal with that many times clash, that you'll have to deal with and figure out how to, which one to choose in any given situation, which is the right thing to do. Okay, so let me just take a minute here. Any questions at this point? Maybe some in the chat still on. Maybe if there are some, you can let me know.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to unmute themselves and chime in, that'd be perfectly fine as well. But otherwise, we'll be on the lookout for more questions.
All right. And again, feel free to interrupt at any time. All right. So again, we are still in this mode of trying to recognize and identify the ethical issue or ethical problem. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So we're again, step one, we're identifying what the issue is. So again, what are the core values at play? Is it a crisis? You know, many times a lot of people will come to you, especially in a leadership role, with what seems to them to be a crisis. Is it really a crisis? Is it a financial issue? Is it a matter of public health? Who are the people involved? Is it the public? Is it employees only? Is it one employee? Is it a group? Is it a number of stakeholders? These are all questions you're going to want to ask when you're trying to identify the nature of the problem. So hopefully I'll get some participation here. I want to kind of talk about these core values. So for those of you in the DC region, our metro is, our train subway is the Washington Metro, run by WMATA. And something happened on March 15th, 2016. Does anyone want to tell me what happened? I can't, but it'd be more fun if someone else does. Come on. Yeah. Excellent. Thanks, Dave. So the actual event that's being referred to in Dave's chat about the Yellow Line fire, that actually occurred in January of 2016. And what happened on March 15th of 2016 was that the then relatively new general manager of Metro, WMATA, Paul Wiedefeld, actually decided in the afternoon that Metro would be shut down that evening for about 29 hours, entirely shut down. Now, what happened the day before on March 14th was a fire as well in the Metro system. But in January, the fire and smoke led to the death of one of the passengers. Luckily, no one died on March 14th or as a result of the March 14th fire. But this led Paul Wiedefeld to make a decision on something. And he shut down the Metro entirely And this was announced in the afternoon of March 15th, and the metro wouldn't come back online for 29 hours starting at midnight that night. So the question is, what is the ethical issue here? What was the concern? What was the nature? What were the dimensions of the issue that Metro and the general manager were dealing with here? What were the core values? Anyone want to take a shot here? What core values were at play in deciding to shut down the entire system for 29 hours?
Public safety.
Public safety, right. Safety versus providing a public service, exactly. Safety versus accessibility. Awesome. So what about this question? So if the metro system was such a safety concern, now keep in mind, the metro wasn't going to shut down until later that evening. So you still had people at work downtown DC who needed to get home. And if metro was such a problem, why didn't they shut it down right away? How do you decide that issue? What values, what core principles are at play there? Remember, 700,000 people typically took the metro on any given workday to pack that back then. People would have been stranded, right? Safety to other riders. So here we have really the risk versus benefits, right? That's exactly right. Too many, there's certainly been a lot of complaints, that's true. So there's a risk, there's a pro versus con risk benefit analysis that definitely is occurring here. We need to get people home, but we have a concern with the safety of this particular, the train, and the trains rather, the tracks. And we have to do something. So here, the general manager decides something had to be done. And regardless, many people were going to be upset one way or another. And for those of you who were watching the news when that was announced, there were many people on one side saying, yeah, great decision, needs to be done, completely understand. Meanwhile, other people are upset that that it wasn't enough notice. They have to get to work the next day or school, or get their kids to school, or get to an appointment. What were they going to do? Exactly. Thank you. Short-term versus long-term. Absolutely. Absolutely. Very difficult decision. So these are decisions that have to be made, okay? But you have to be considering all the various factors. You certainly have the short-term versus long-term. You've got public health and safety. You have people's convenience and what they need to do in any given day. But there's a responsibility. There's a duty. There's an obligation to the public. And what are you going to do to protect those individuals as they use your service, as they use the metro? So this is just one example of how these ethical issues and ethical dilemmas come into play here. And obviously, those of us in the DC area fully know that the metro continues to have its issues to this day. But it's just one example of this. So I want to move, we talked about these things. So as you saw, I had set forth the kind of decision-making framework earlier, and step one was gathering information. Step two, was determining or recognizing the ethical issue. Step two here is really gathering information. And I don't want to give this short shrift because it's important, but I want to talk about decision making and how certain things impact our decision making. But this would be the next step. And then the third step would be trying to identify possible options, or what are the possible consequences of each of these options? What are the ethical values involved? And that last bullet point, I just want to mention a little bit more. And that is, at some point, you're going to have to announce what you're doing, especially if it's known to whatever group will be impacted. You'll have to explain. And one thing that I think is helpful to do is actually practice out loud saying what your decision is, or how you're going to explain your decision. Because a lot of times when you do that, you'll suddenly see that there may be some holes or flaws or things you didn't consider. Okay, think about how the audience is going to hear your decision, how the audience or the impacted stakeholders will be impacted. And hold on one second. So I do want to chat a little bit about what kind of are some universally typical methods of resolving ethical issues. And you really have three. There's utilitarianism, a duty-based method, and virtue. So utilitarianism is easy for me to say, utilitarianism. So typically known as the greatest good for the greatest number, or the least harm for the least number of people. And that's what that first bullet point is. It doesn't mean there's no harm. This method also looks at the consequences of a decision, and that is what drives the decision. Again, what are the consequences? What's the greatest good for the greatest number of people, for the least harm for the least number of people, or most number of people? This focuses on what are the future effects of possible actions. One of the downsides, obviously, is it involves some compromise. And we'll see in the next method, there's really no compromise there. Okay. And this is the most common approach to evaluating ethical issues, especially where there are large groups involved. So then we have this duty-based method, or deontological. That's easy. These are based on rules and one's duties or obligations. And these can be written or are obligations as human beings to other people. But we won't hurt others. We'll care for children. Universal themes like that. The consequences of the decision do not drive this analysis. We are trying to do the right thing, and we're trying to focus on rules. Almost, I probably should have the word almost regardless of the possible outcome. And then finally, we have kind of a virtue-based method of resolving ethical issues. And this is concerned with what kind of person we want to be and what our actions say about our character. And as this third bullet indicates, is that, by being honest, by being just, by being a generous person, you develop this honorable character. By doing that, you will likely then make good choices when you are faced with ethical dilemmas and ethical issues. So these are just three typical ways. I'm sure you can do research and find some other descriptions of these, but these are three typical ways of resolving ethical issues. So we're not quite at making the decision yet. We have to have, in addition to have an understanding of the actual ethical rules and obligations that apply to any given situation, and being attuned to those and understanding how people make decisions. You have to understand why sometimes good people make bad decisions, engage in bad behavior, and make unethical decisions, because it happens all the time. Now, of course, there are bad people making unethical decisions. But you need to understand this because understand how these decisions are made, the pressures that you're facing, and you have to acknowledge that you're facing, or the biases that you have to acknowledge exist. And you have to know that when you're making a decision. You have to also know that to decide whether you should be the one making a decision in any given situation. All right, so why does this happen? Why do good people make decisions that are unethical or borderline unethical? Well, one is we always predict that in any future hypothetical situation that we will always be ethical. We will always do the most ethical thing that could possibly describe from whatever that hypothetical situation is. Take I've got extra money from the grocery store, or, I benefited from some rules infraction in golf, or some other example like that. You'll say, of course, I'll report myself. But unfortunately, we do several different things at two different points in time. The first is when we are making the decision. A lot of times we will say there is no ethical issue, or we just don't see the ethical dimensions, which is, again, a pitch to understand ethical rules and obligations. Or there are some pressures from other sources to influence our decision that 2 days ago, 3 days ago, when you were considering it, when you were considering what to do, weren't there. Your boss wasn't talking to you about what you're going to do until the time you were making this decision or about to communicate the decision. So that's one point in time you have to pay attention to. And the other point in time is, unfortunately, after the fact. We will engage in any number of rationalizations to justify our decisions, to argue that, in fact, we behaved or our decision was ethical. So here are a few things I think you should pay attention to. All right, watch out. It was for a good cause. The ends justifies the means, right? I had to do this. It was necessary. And if it's necessary, it's ethical. This third bullet comes across a lot. It was just a business decision. And I think this happens a lot where there's a failure to really recognize the ethical issue. That really whatever they're presented with involve no ethics whatsoever. But you will hear this a lot. Or I was just doing my job. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. Or you're explaining this to someone and they're asking you, why did you do that? And you say you did it for them. Just fighting fire with fire. And these last two here, everyone does it. Others do it all the time. Everyone else is right. You hear that all the time. They do it. They do it. They do it. Why am I getting in trouble? Of course I should do it. Everyone else does it. Or it's okay if I didn't personally gain from it. And then finally, I can still be ejected, even though I may have skin in the game, so to speak. Some other rationalizations. It's in everyone's best interest. No one will find out. Or they know, and this is problematic, this is a sign clearly or symptom of an unethical culture, that they know their boss will protect them, even if they did something unethical. So again, these are some points to just keep in mind. When you start hearing these things, there's problems. Some last points about decision making when you have ethical issues. Actually, they're not last points because I have more coming up after this. It's what can be done. These phrases have been said so many times. Yeah, what can be done? Well, hopefully part of it is, and we're going to get to this here in terms of the decision, you actually, as a leader and a person, you actually are making the correct and right decision. And it actually kind of gets to this first bullet point. A lot of times when we're making the decision, we really, and this isn't so much always a money issue when we use the word cost, but it's that we overestimate that the cost or risk or harm of doing the right thing. We overestimate that, and we underestimate the risk or cost of failing to do the right thing. Okay, whether you're Pinto with the exploding gas tanks in the 70s, or you're the Tylenol, and what you do, when the Tylenol bottles were poisoned, what you do as an organization says a lot about you as a person, an organization, how you view other people. With the Pinto gas tanks exploding, the organizational culture was that safety was not a priority. Sales were. So the leaders weren't listening to the safety people and the engineers, they were listening to the sales folks. So that's to kind of the question that was posed with these phrases. The organization and the culture matters a lot. And I will say it's certainly, and this is kind of a trite phrase, but it's true. It all comes from the top. What leaders do and how they act and how they behave and what their reputation is for being a truth teller and acknowledging the truth and protecting individuals who raise issues makes a difference. In addition, keep in mind your decision-making is going to be influenced, especially if you stand to benefit one way or another from whatever the decision is. And the more you want whatever that thing is, or the more whatever this decision is might harm you, the more your decision-making will be flawed and probably result in not the right thing. So again, these are all things to keep in mind as you're making decisions or you're observing other people behave and make decisions as well. Which gets us to, we have to also acknowledge the fact that sometimes we don't call other people on it. We ignore ethical lapses in other people. And you need to understand why that happens. It's not always that we're just, by nature unethical. We're raised to not be, generally. But it's that through time, sometimes we ignore them. And here are some examples. So one example, this first one, is we will not see the ethical failings in others if it would harm me to call it out. So for example, if one of my subordinates is engaging in unethical behavior and I don't do anything about it and I don't tell my boss because maybe the boss will blame me. Or there's some organizational loyalty to not call out the behavior, or there's a money incentive. Maybe calling it out will cost me money or cost a good friend in the organization money. This next one is very typical. And this is where things, this is where it comes up typically in the decision making or the time of the decision, but also in the after the fact, post hoc rationalizations, is that when the unethical behavior occurs over time, sometimes it's very difficult to see that. It's just like, if you're with someone every day, maybe you don't notice certain things about them, right? But if you only see them once every 3 months, you're going to notice it. Or we move the ethical line. We say, here's the line at decision time, we say, you know what? It's not really, we're not up to that line. We move it. We move the goalpost. And we do that afterwards as well, after we make decisions. And then we have kind of this approach that we will judge the ethicality of someone's behavior or decisions based on if there's harm, which is not the case when you're evaluating and viewing ethical dilemmas and ethical situations. There's not always an identifiable victim or an identifiable harm. So again, keep these in mind as you are looking at a decision, as you're dealing with some kind of dilemma. Chances are there's some clash of core values or principles. There's some ethical dimension to it, and you have to try to figure it out. Because once you figure it out, hopefully you'll be guided to making the right decision. I'm not saying it's an easy decision, but the right decision for your organization, for you at that point in time. All right, so now can we make a decision? Yes, let's make a decision. So keep in mind, decision may be to do nothing. Maybe you're presented with the option of changing one office's mission and adding more to it, or leaving it the same. Then you may leave it the same, or to do something drastically different, or how to handle a crisis. You know, whatever it is, you're making a decision. But as I mentioned before, sorry, there's one more slide I forgot about. There are other factors you should consider, and this comes up actually a fair amount. Who has to make the decision? A lot of times when you're a leader, people will come to you with all kinds of issues. And I know many of you out there will say, well, a lot of times people come to me and you think, why didn't they solve it themselves? And that's generally a good notion, that things should be resolved as low as possible in an organization. Question is whether you need to make a decision, someone else needs to make a decision, and why. And that should be considered too. A lot of times when people come to us, we assume we're the ones that we should decide. And maybe that's the case, but maybe it should be the person who brought it to you, or it should be someone above you. So keep that in mind. Oops. Hold on one second. Okay, there we go. And this relates to step 3 when I was mentioning practice explaining your decision out loud to yourself or to some independent, objective person. Because you're going to have to. You're going to have to explain this to your boss, to somebody, to the press, maybe the inspector general, to those who are negatively affected. And maybe it's one person. Maybe it's just one person you have to tell that they're fired, or they're being reassigned, or they're not doing a good job, or you have to testify before Congress. You have to explain it to somebody. Does it make sense? Do you feel good about it? Can you sleep at night? That you considered everything, that you considered that there are ethical dimensions to it, and that you made the right decision for you in that point in time. All right, so we're pretty much at the end, but I just wanted to, well, we are at the end. So there's lots of ways to create a culture of ethical decision-making, but I would say it's easier to have a culture at work where there's not ethical decision-making. And it doesn't take much for people at all levels to see that ethics are not important and doing the right thing is not important. Some of these things are just not rocket science. You want to make sure people understand there are ethical rules, particularly new people coming into the workforce. There are ethics rules, and here are why we have ethics rules. You want to encourage people to discuss them, talk about them. You also need to develop and take very good care of your reputation for making ethical decisions, behaving ethically at work, following the rules. Make sure people know that. And there's a lot there's a lot you can do to make sure people know that. You can have ethics training. There's one pocket of a federal agency that I know that they have every staff meeting every month. They have one person within the staff. They're responsible for presenting some kind of ethics issue to the entire staff, and everyone has to do it as they rotate. And to me, this shows from the leadership point of view and to others that ethics are important, and they're part of, especially for federal employees and government employees, they're part of your job. Okay, public service is a public trust. So if for no other reason you want to be acting ethically, but I think because ethical decisions lead to good decisions and good organizations, good products, good services to stakeholders and the public generally. So we learned a lot, at least I talked a lot about how to recognize that ethical issues, because that's the name of the game. That is the most important thing. And hopefully when you develop skills to evaluate those, you develop the skills and experience in making decisions regarding those. So I will stop there and we'll see if there's questions. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Jim. Thank you so much to all for joining us for our FEDTalks session today, our final one. We just want to share our gratitude to Jim for his vast wealth of knowledge and insights on recognizing and addressing ethical issues in decision-making. We have about roughly 30 minutes left for some Q&A portion. There's also a link to the evaluation form and a check-in form as well. Feel free to send in your questions to the chat or even just raising your hand, unmuting yourself, whatever goes. As a reminder, we will be posting the recording of this session in addition to related resources on our website at key.american.edu. But we'll be here for the remaining 30 minutes to field some questions.
And I just want to note that at the end of the slides, I'll just show you here, there are some various resources for dealing with ethics issues and ethical decision making. One thing I don't think is listed, but it might be. No, it's not. That is every Sunday, the New York Times Magazine has a column called The Ethicist. And if you want to exercise that ethics muscle, I suggest you look at that. The other resource that I typically will look at is the Ethics Unwrapped, which is the University of Texas Business School, which has some excellent short, and when I say short, I mean really short videos and explanations about various concepts within ethics throughout. So that's one resource. I'm happy to take any questions.
Sure. Could you say what that business school name was again?
It's right here. It'll be a part of the slide deck. It's called Ethics Unwrapped, and it's the University of Texas McComb School of Business.
Oh, okay. And I did have a question for you. Have you ever worked with ethics in gamification using educational games to teach ethics?
I haven't worked with games per se, no.
Okay, thank you.
But I'm confident that they'll be on one of those resources there. Any recommendations if you've left a job due to ethical issues? So that's a really great question about how to explain why you left a job. There's all kinds of dynamics there, including the dynamic and principle of telling the truth. But there's also your own interest in gaining employment. And, if you can tell the truth and still obtain that job, that's great. But keep in mind, you're not always obligated to, you can still tell the truth and perhaps not even explain that you left because of ethical issues. You're not always obligated just to talk about everything about all the reasons and details about why you might have left a job. But again, it may depend on the questions that are asked. Well, thank you everyone for sitting through this. Hopefully you learned something about this. I'm happy you can reach out to me and happy to talk further about it. I can also stick around too if you have further questions, but thank you everybody.